that is the cornerstone of information security. Really, it helps us to identify everything by using IAM, Identity and Access Management. Controlling how resources are accessed and typically protected from any unauthorized modification or disclosure is of utmost importance on your network. We've talked about the different types of controls that have been put into place, like technical controls, physical controls, administrative controls. And access, if you've looked at any of the NIST 853, 171, or the cybersecurity framework, access is one of the largest families of controls that is recommended to be taken very, very seriously. And for all the right reasons, because the attackers usually try to focus on one of the most exploited aspects of security is access control. And so we need to really take everything that we've learned so far and practice or an applied science behind the defense in depth approach, so that layered model of security, to really put us in a position where we can keep the bad guys out. And so with access controls, there's a whole bunch of really neat things that that end up happening. And if we try to quantify it, we really have, the assets, which we've already identified. We know what subjects are and objects as well. And for us to be able to access the information between, a user, a subject, and an object that's out there, typically we would want to be able to try to accomplish some sort of task on that object. And it's extremely important that we know a lot about access control, because it can be one of the first lines of defense whenever we're trying to keep out the bad guys from getting unauthorized access to our systems or network resources. And so the CIA triad really comes into play here, bringing it back into life. So, we talk about assets, we talk about subjects, and we talk about objects. Let's jump in and get right down into some of the details here. So what are some of the functions that access control provides? Well, we want to allow the people that we want into our system or our network, our software, and then we want to keep the other people out. Then I think that's as simple as it can possibly get. We want to try to figure out how to know who is trying to access it, challenge them for verification purposes, and then see if they are authorized after they've been challenged for any type of permissions on the network. And then everything that they're doing while on there, we want to try to monitor and hold them accountable for that. And so we really get into this IAAA that you may be familiar with by now, which is identification, authentication, authorization, and accountability, that really come into play for this. And so how do we do that? Well, usually when somebody's onboarded, we create an identity for them. And that's typically a unique identifier that is something like an email or an email address. And then we provide them some mechanism that we can challenge for them to authenticate themselves. And there's different types of ways that we can do that. There's type 1, type 2, type 3, which are something you know, something you have, and something you are, or something you do and somewhere you are. And so these come to life whenever we start to really hunker down into the bowels of access control. Let's talk a little bit about these. So if this was a mechanism for access control, what would it be in your opinion? What kind of authentication would this be? Something you know, something you have, something you are? What do you think? Yeah, something you have. Good. All right, what about this right here? It's a big old eye. Somebody is scanning. What do you guys think for this one? Go ahead and put it into the chat. Yeah, something you are, right? I know Captain Obvious is probably hitting us upside the head here with these last two. And really, it comes down to any two of these is considered what we call in our business something you know, something you have, something you are. It's considered strong. Any two of them are considered strong authentication. And so two-factor authentication is typically best practice, at least two-factor authentication, because it's considered quote-unquote strong authentication. Multi-factor authentication is typically when we are looking for, something you know and something you have in a way that is meaningful. This could even be an additional one besides just these two factors right here. But we want to make sure that we can verify the person who they say is who they say they are and create what we typically call a one-to-one match. Are who they say they are, and if they are who they say they are, go ahead and challenge them to provide something that will authenticate them. And sometimes this can be a little tricky. So what type of authentication is this? Well, there's a fingerprint here and a fingerprint that you put over here. So at some point, though, you needed to enroll a person into the biometric system, right? And so we needed to capture this fingerprint at some point to have it on file so we could compare it and match. Remember that one-to-one match for verification purposes. So in this particular case, that's a single factor authentication. Well, in this particular case, we have the John Doe, who this looks like a CAC, and he has plus his PIN right here. So CAC plus his PIN. What would this be? Go ahead and put it into the chat window. Factor authentication. Yeah, two-factor. Good. Something you know, which would be the PIN. Good. And then something you have, right? So something you know, something you have. So multi-factor authentication. Good. And so with all of those, something that we typically will see as well is a lot of times in practice, we see these single factors of authentication, which typically is a password. And a lot of organizations have either moved away or have plans in the future to move away from using passwords. But tons of corporations still out there use passwords. And so with passwords, it's important to know that, yep, you guessed it, NIST has passed or published a special publication, 863B, as a Bravo, that goes into the digital identity guidelines. And it's been around a little while. But it just goes into the best practices for using proper passwords and how to implement those. What is some of the age of the passwords? Usually it's 60, 90 days, 60 or 90 days for different passwords. The complexity, usually 12 characters. That's usually best practice, is at least 12 characters. Maybe camel case or bumpy caps, Hungarian notation, whatever you call it, to a point where it makes it much more difficult having upper and lowercase, as well as alphanumeric or special characters as well. So it comes in handy as you kind of traverse these different objects here. Many companies that still use passwords oftentimes don't let you use the previous 10. So a bunch of different ways that we can actually have passwords in our environment. So there is this idea of what's called the triple A. And so the triple A is the authentication, authorization, and accounting. And just like the words kind of imply, you prove who you say you are. Like when a police officer pulls you over, they immediately say, license and registration, please. And when they do that, usually you provide them, your driver's license, and then prove that you've actually registered the vehicle. You may even need to show proof of insurance, which is typically the case. And then, when you are authenticated, what do you have access to? Like, what are you authorized to have access to? And then everything that you're doing on the network is monitored. And typically, this is governed through what we call directory services. And so directory services, if you're not familiar with that, is put into functional units called OUs, or organizational units, OU, not to be confused with Oklahoma University. And things within the directory are given what is called a CN, a common name, and also a distinguished name, so a DN. And the distinguished name is your object in the directory that has all the data about you. For me, when I first started learning about directory services, it was called X.500 or X500. And so the way that it was explained to me was it's kind of like the old school white pages, phone books, where everything is indexed and assigned a group, and categorically, like, the 26 groups of the alphabet, the different, first initial of the last name. But it's kind of like the white pages, where if you have never seen one of those before, they're a big old book that gets delivered usually once every year, or it used to at least, that allows you to look up people's names, their addresses, and their phone number. And so it really is an index, and it provides us this term that you often see. It's called metadata. These directories do. And so this is one of the easier definitions, if you've never heard of it before. Metadata, I'll put it into the chat, is equal to data about data. Data about data. So the most popular directory that's out there is Active Directory, AD, Active Directory. So Active Directory has been around for, I think, about 25 years now. Active Directory, we call it AD. And, that's typically something that is really a game changer for Microsoft. So Microsoft created Active Directory, and now they've transitioned over to Microsoft Azure Active Directory, which they have rebranded into what they call Intra. You may be familiar with Intra, and I put those into the chat window if you're not familiar with them. So Microsoft Active Directory allows you to control your domain using this service that runs on a server that's called a directory. And so we put users and computers into the directory, And when we put the users and computers into the directory, depending on what permissions they have, they can access the domain and any objects in the domain that they have privy to use if they're authorized to. And so that is at a super high level where directory services come into play. Anytime that we're looking to authenticate a person or an identity, it would challenge it to, typically in 90% of the world, uses Active Directory. 90% uses Active Directory. Now, are they using it on premise? A lot of them have gone to hybrid where, you know, it's using Azure Active Directory as well, and they have a little connector, or they've gone to full Microsoft 365 to the intra Active Directory. And so these really, oh yeah, I think anybody that can afford it, but I mean they're in Europe, they're in, you know, Asia, they're, yeah, but most corporations, like a study I read a couple of years ago that something crazy like 91% of the people surveyed, or the corporations surveyed. So I don't know if it has to be in the Western world, but yeah, I mean, I'm sure that Georgia Tech has some flavor of Active Directory running in there somewhere, you know. All right, so in addition to that, we can have this Star Trekian word down here. Whoops. The Star Trekian word, let me see if I can draw a little chevron here. I want to do a pen. So do a little chevron. That's horrible. Right? So my chevron here that says I'm lived long and prosperous is this thing that's called a federated identity. This federated identity is something that allows us to, if you have a corporation and I have a corporation, and both of these are running Active Directory underneath it, what we can do, or some sort of directory server, it didn't just have to be Active Directory, is we can build what's called a trust relationship between these two. And based off of that trust relationship, we can federate the identities. And that way, this one over here on the left-hand side, let me change the color. This one right here can utilize your credentials to authenticate over to this one and vice versa.